Welcome to Bible Fiber. I am Shelley Neese, president of the Jerusalem Connection, a Christian organization devoted to sharing the story of the people of Israel, both ancient and modern. This week, we are continuing our study of the book of Ezra, diving into chapter 6. This chapter concludes the story of the first 2 decades of the people's restoration to Judah. From the narrator's perspective, the first half of the book was the Old Age, a look back at the tale of the founding fathers of restored Israel and their completion of the temple. Our last chapter and episode ended with the Persian officials searching for a document to authenticate the Israelites' claim that Cyrus gave them permission to rebuild their temple. The Israelites did not have hard feelings about Tattenai's inquiry. He was doing his job as a provincial leader. Plus, they seemed confident officials could resolve the matter. The community held dear their historical memory of the declaration of Cyrus. Even more importantly, they felt the eye of their God was upon them. The narrator explained that the royal search for the decree came up empty-handed in Babylon. Though they did not find the document where they originally expected, they located the scroll in the archives of faraway Ecbatana, the capital of the former Median Empire and the mountainous summer residence of the Persian king. The narrator, keeping to his inclusion of primary documents, provided the full text. A record, in the first year of his reign, King Cyrus issued a decree. Concerning the house of God at Jerusalem, let the house be rebuilt, the place where sacrifices are offered and burnt offerings are brought. Its height shall be 60 cubits, and its width 60 cubits, with 3 courses of hewn stones and 1 course of timber. Let the cost be paid from the royal treasury. Moreover, let the gold and silver vessels of the house of God that Nebuchadnezzar took out of the temple in Jerusalem and brought to Babylon be restored and brought back to the temple in Jerusalem, each to its place. You shall put them in the house of God. An attentive reader of Ezra might notice that the decree given in Ezra 6 is a much fuller decree than the one given in Ezra 1. The first decree focused more on the return of exiles to Judah, while the second omitted any mention of exiles and instead detailed the parameters of the Jerusalem temple project. Also, what we cannot tell reading Ezra in the English translation is that the narrator relayed the first decree in Hebrew and the second in Aramaic. In fact, Ezra 4 through 6 and chapter 7 all have sections written in Aramaic. The only other biblical book to include portions in Aramaic is Daniel. Aramaic was internationalized as a common language since the days of the Assyrian Empire. The narrator of Ezra demonstrated his skill as a careful historian to preserve the letters and first-hand materials in their original language. Of course, his audience also spoke Aramaic from their days in exile, so they could read the narrative in both languages. Biblical scholarship once believed that the narrator of Ezra relayed 2 different versions of the same decree. The most common view today, with the exploration of comparative records in the Persian archives, is that there were 2 decrees to serve different purposes. The first proclamation in Hebrew was an announcement for the Hebrew-speaking exiles. The scroll found in Ecbatana was an official internal memorandum for the empire's administrative purposes. Attaching Cyrus's proclamation to the end of the section, just as it launched the beginning of our book, also served as a literary tool that Bible writers often use to signal the start and end of a narrative. The words of Cyrus are the bookends to the 6-chapter narrative of the first wave of returnees. The Edict of Cyrus, as relayed to Tattenai, resolved each of his questions one by one about the Israelites' permission to build, their financing of their project, and the approved size of the monumental building. According to the memorandum, the temple's height shall be 60 cubits and its width 60 cubits. Remember, scribal errors most often occur with numbers. Solomon's temple was 90 by 30 by 45 feet. It is hard to imagine that the second temple so greatly departed from the blueprint of the first in relation to height. Also, 90 feet is a reasonable number for length or width, but 90 feet in height is highly unlikely. The memorandum called for the return of the temple treasures to Jerusalem. Of course, the story did not mention an idol because Jerusalem was an idol-less temple. In addressing the issue of the temple's financing, the memorandum explained that the project costs shall be paid from the royal treasury. Upon finding the original memorandum, Darius responded decisively. He issued an order heaping even more favor on the Jews and their temple project than Cyrus. He ordered all the Persian administrators, including Tattenai, to leave Judah and keep away and let the work on this house of God alone. The investigation closed and all interference halted. The promise of no more Persian imperial meddling had to be music to the Israelites' ears. The king's support of the project was a faraway endorsement which stopped local interruptions. Darius also promised full financial backing for the temple project. Cyrus promised to finance the rebuild, but Darius added that the royal treasury would also pay for the daily sacrifices: animals, wheat, salt, wine, and oil. That was a generous upgrade from the original commitment. However, the king clarified the money would come through tax deductions on the province. He said the cost is to be paid to these people in full and without delay from the royal revenue, the tribute of the province beyond the river. Beyond the river was the Persian title for all their territory on the west side of the Euphrates River, what today we call Mesopotamia. Darius spoke in the language of the Bible, saying the people of Judah should be free to offer pleasing sacrifices to the God of heaven. Yahweh had told Moses that the burnt offering should be a pleasing odor to the Lord. Darius referred to Jerusalem as the place that God had established his name there. Referring to the temple as the place where God put his name went all the way back to Deuteronomy. Darius's culturally sensitive language indicated Darius knew how the Jews talked about their God in Jerusalem. Darius added a special request for prayer for the life of the king and his children. The Cyrus cylinder requested that when peoples of the empire offered sacrifices to their local gods, they say a prayer for the long life of the king. It was Darius's turn to ask for intercession on his behalf. Polytheistic Persian leaders did not see local ancient traditions as a threat to the empire, but rather a boost to their overall supernatural coverage. Despite the Persians' general rule of charitability when it came to local religions, Darius's favorable attitude towards the Jewish temple seems a little over the top. Historians suggest another possible motivation to explain his enthusiasm. History tells us that Darius likely marched through Judah in 519 BCE to quell a revolt in Egypt. Perhaps it was in Darius's political interest to solicit the favor of Egypt's neighbors in Jerusalem and its surroundings. If so, the narrator of Ezra shows no interest in Persian political maneuverings. All that mattered was that God had turned the heart of the king of Assyria to them. In the ancient Near East, royal decrees often attached threats to their official orders. Darius's order warned, "If anyone alters this edict, a beam shall be pulled out of the house of the perpetrator, who then shall be impaled on it." Since Assyrian times, impalement was a popular form of punishment for wrongdoers. Apparently, the Persians kept up the Assyrian tradition. The people of the land stood in opposition to the returnees rebuilding, but they took seriously the level of imperial protection given to the temple project. With Darius acting as the personal benefactor of the Jerusalem temple, the local opposition had no chance of throwing up additional roadblocks. Darius promised that if they did, his henchmen would turn their own houses into dunghills. Tattenai and his associates followed the orders of the king, giving every green light for the builders to finish the temple. In fact, they did not lose any time during the period of investigation because Tattenai wisely and generously allowed the building to continue while a palace searched for the Edict of Cyrus. The exhortations of Haggai and Zechariah got the people out of their spiritual stupor so they could build with confidence. They knew they were following God's plan. In less than 5 years, they finished the temple. The narrator credited the miracle to the command of God and the decree of the Persian king, saying, "They finished their building by the command of the God of Israel and by decree of Cyrus, Darius, and King Artaxerxes." Technically, Artaxerxes had nothing to do with the temple rebuild, but because he later showed favor to the construction of Jerusalem's city walls, the narrator inserted him in the list of good kings. The verse is a reminder that even if Judah lived under foreign rule, God still held sway over every earthly leader. The dedication ceremony for the temple brought out everyone: the people of Israel, the priests and the Levites, and the rest of the returned exiles. It took 20 years from the time they returned until the moment they completed the temple. After 50 years of exile and 20 years of struggling to relaunch the nation in Israel, they fulfilled the prophecy of Jeremiah. Only when Babylon's 70 years are completed will I visit you, and will I fulfill to you my promise and bring you back to this place. The second temple, though not as grand as the first, lasted much longer. The temple would take on periods of renovation, such as under Simon the Just in 200 BCE, and more famously Herod the Great in 20 CE. However, the Second Temple served as a continuous place of Jewish worship for over 4 centuries. The dedication ceremony for the Second Temple was much smaller than the First Temple dedication, comparing the number of animals required for each occasion. The narrator wrote that they all ate from the sacrificial meat of 100 bulls, 200 rams, 400 lambs, and 12 male goats. This is the climax of the entire first section. At the temple dedication ceremony, the narrator emphasized the spirit of joy and only joy that permeated the community. No longer are they plagued by sadness in comparing the Second Temple to Solomon's temple. After the dedication ceremony, the people gathered again for the holiday of Passover. The Jewish liturgical calendar is the time anchor for Ezra as a historic text. With the completion of the altar, they had celebrated Sukkot. With the completion of the whole temple, they gathered to mark Passover and the Feast of Unleavened Bread, technically 2 different holidays that merged together. The opening scene in Ezra had called back to the story of the Exodus and the taking of a collection from their neighbors to aid their journey. The closing scene linked the Exodus with the returnees celebrating the holiday that marked God's deliverance from their captivity in Egypt. I imagine the rituals and traditions of their Passover Seder meals felt especially poignant to the newly returned foreign captives. As every element of the tradition pointed to freedom and deliverance, they realized the blessing of their generation. They witnessed once again God's hand actively working in the world to rescue them. The narrator emphasized that all the priests, Levites, and returned exiles participated in the offerings. Everyone needed ritual purity. Without the sacrificial system, the people of God had no way to deal with the problem of sin. They were eager to repent and reinstitute the sacrifices in Jerusalem. In Ezra and the post-exilic prophets, we learn that the people were conscious of the sins of their ancestors and determined to get things right this time. The sin offering, a Passover lamb sacrificed for every family, was essential to purify the whole community from the contamination of exile. Among the Passover celebrants were those who separated themselves from the pollutions of the nations of the land to seek the Lord. According to Exodus, circumcision was a requirement for all converts participating in the Passover celebration. The narrator does not note the status of the separator's circumcision, which means these are likely already circumcised Israelites. They were perhaps those Israelites who stayed behind in the land after the Babylonian takeover. In the years of separation from the community, they participated in the religions of the surrounding pagan peoples, blending Yahweh worship with worship of other gods. With the return of the exiles, the separators renounced paganism and all other gods, joining themselves once again to the covenant of Yahweh. The rest of Ezra and Nehemiah is harsh in their position towards outsiders. When the threat of assimilation with paganism rose in the community, Ezra and Nehemiah built up literal and proverbial walls between the Israelites and their neighbors. So it is important to remember this moment when all who feared Yahweh were invited to the feast. The inclusion of the separators in the Passover feast foreshadowed the extension of the covenant. In 4 centuries, Christ will die for the sins of the entire world, paving the way for all who call on his name to be saved from the consequence of sin. Thank you for listening, and please continue to participate in this Bible reading challenge. Next week, we are reading Ezra 7. 60 years passed between the close of chapter 6 and the arrival of Ezra the Reformer in chapter 7. In a sense, we've spent the last 6 weeks studying the prologue to the Reform movement. This marks the break between the two halves of the book. For all of the biblical references each week, please see the show transcript on our blog or by signing up for our emails at thejerusalemconnection.us. I don't say all the references in the podcast, but they're all in the transcript. Send me a message, I'll respond. Bible Fiber is available on YouTube or wherever you listen to your podcast. Shabbat Shalom.